Hello and welcome to Diaspora Connect on AAU TV. AAU TV is the voice of higher education in Africa. Today I am at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Kenyatta University in Kenya. And we are going to talk about Afro-Asian literature and its contribution to the development of East Africa. We are following this discussion on all our social media handles on the screens and on our dedicated website tv.aau.org. We are going for a short break, and when we come back, I will introduce the guests of the program. Stay tuned.
Are you an institution or individual? Do you intend to organize a memorable event to be archived for future reference? Then look no further than AAU Studios, because it's your best bet. With our spacious studio and state-of-the-art media equipment such as 4K Panasonic video cameras, KinoFlow lights, assorted microphones, live streaming machines and others, you are sure to get the best of production. Visit us at Trinity Avenue, East Legon, adjacent the National Accreditation Board, or contact the AAU studio via the following addresses: info@aau.org, AAUTV@aau.org, Ransford @aau.org. Alternatively, you can call us on 0244 185 998 or 0244 693 342.
Welcome back from the break. This is Diaspora Connect on AAU TV, the voice of higher education in Africa. Today I'm talking about the role of the Afro-Asians in the development of East Africa. And to do justice to this topic, I have with me a lecturer and a researcher here in Kenyatta University in the name of Justus S.K. Makokha. Welcome to AAU TV, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, can you tell me a little bit about this center that you run your programs?
Yeah, well, we belong to the Department of Literature, Linguistics and Foreign Languages, but this one operates under a bigger umbrella, that is the School of Humanities and Social Sciences.
Okay. Let's delve straight into the topic.
Yes.
Literature. What is the role of literature in the development of any country?
Literature should not be seen, in terms of that question, literature should not be seen in isolation, but it should be seen as an aspect of a people's culture or cultural way of life. And when you look at it that way, then the broader question would be, what is the role of culture in a given society? I think there are three broad ways in which we can look at this. One, culture as the firmament on which societies and the identities of such societies are located or anchored. Secondly, we can look at culture as the ethos of people's or a community's way of life. And when we look at that, it that way, then the literatures of a people also captures the spirit of those people. This expresses itself in many ways in their everyday activities, in the manner in which they use language, and when they use language creatively for purposes of interaction and communication, then literature ceases just to be an art, but it becomes part of the communication or fabric of such a society. And thirdly, you'd also look at literature in terms of education. And because of the enduring traditions from our orality and our traditional pasts, oral literatures have always served as a kind of hidden curriculum, transmitting all sorts of values, ethics, and cultural standards of a given community. Here in East Africa, the Maasai people express their Maasai identity through their oral traditions and literatures as well. But when you look at it from the post-independence period, then the conceptualization of literature as something written and as an academic subject to be studied in an educational situation, then we look at literature as not just a means of education, but it is also an academic discipline or an academic area. For example, I have a PhD in literature. That means that literature is the academic discipline from where my PhD is located. So you can easily look at literature in those three broad generalizations. Literature as culture, literature as a means of instruction and information of a people's way of life, and literature also as an academic subject which is taught in schools and universities.
Why should somebody studying mathematics be interested in literature?
That's a very interesting question, because here in Kenya, for example, we are having a curriculum renewal. We are putting to an end the old curriculum that has been in place for the past almost 30 years, from 1987 there up to this particular year. And the government has now officially rolled out a new curriculum, which is supposed to align the interests of the government and the national goals with the emerging challenges of the global world today. And as a result of this, the government is placing a lot of focus on subjects which are science-based, technology-based, and so on and so forth. The worry among most members of the arts or the artistic subjects is that this scientific or technological orientation of the new curriculum may happen at the expense of the arts, which leads us now back to your question, what role does literature play in a community or a society that is interested in progress based on sciences and technology?
Right.
The reason we look at science and the arts in terms of their oppositional confrontation is that we have a very narrow view of what education is all about. Education doesn't have to be separated or doesn't have to be approached in terms of disciplinary orientations.
Right.
Each knowledge community and each knowledge framework has something to contribute to the holistic growth of a human being. So when you look at education as the positive change that can occur as a result of knowledge being given to an individual, that knowledge cannot be entirely sourced from scientific or technological subjects. The arts have a very important role to play, especially in shaping the holistic image of an individual. It is interesting, for example, here in East Africa or in Kenya, where we speak Kiswahili, to take note of a proverb that says that mwacha mila ni mtumwa, which simply means that he who abandons his cultural traditions, of which literature is part, is like a slave. Is a person who is de-anchored, is a person without anchorage, is like a person who is living in a diaspora, far away from his maternal land and at a certain consequence.
Okay.
Yes.
The literature or the literature passed on from pre-colonial era to this stage.
Yes.
Has there been any significant change in terms of the theme or the focus of the stories told?
What one can look at now and what makes this society we live in ourselves today as being different from the one that our ancestors lived in is the rapid and ubiquitous presence and dissemination of technology. Right. As a result of this, the manner in which we package narratives today is not the way in which those narratives were packaged and transmitted by our ancestors. The modalities of expressions that were at their behest were such that the oral tradition or the oral faculty was supreme. We talk of orality or the orate nature of African society across the board. From Kenya to Ghana, Lesotho to Namibia, it is the same. And we therefore look at the changes that are happening to the literary landscape today in terms of the proliferation of technology in packaging, dissemination, consumption, and production of literature. Insofar as that is the case then, you would say that the narratives have not changed much, but the modes and modalities of expressing these narratives have changed. Today, traditional stories are not told by the fireside, but they are told within radio programs, whether as a radio program for school-going children or as a radio program for adults, whereby a cultural authority is brought to a vernacular language-based radio station, and he or she disseminates certain aspects of that communal life, whether literary or otherwise, and this is broadcasted to millions of people scattered across distances. So the role of FM radio stations in the transmission of oral literatures today is something that one may see here as a unique case in point.
Is there no dilution of information because there may be multiplicity of means of, spreading the literature? But if it were oral tradition, you know that the grandfather is telling the grandchildren then goes to become grandparents, to transfer. Now we have radio stations, we have translations of the literature into various languages. Don't you see that we may at a point lose, you know, some critical information along the transmission line? True.
What you're saying is true, and indeed it is a sorry state of affairs that we are in today. Scholars in the West have talked about these changes already, never forgetting that our societies kind of are simulacra or imitations of those societies from the West as a result of our imperial contact, of course, with Europe. And as a result of these discussions about these transmutations and transformations that are happening to us as novelty or as newness have also existed elsewhere. Okay. For example, when you look at France in the 1960s way up to the 1980s, they talked about the postmodern turn. And they talk about the postmodern society, postmodernity, and so on and so forth, the proliferation of multiple standpoints, multiple perspectives, multiple modalities of existence, and so on and so forth. In such a society, and that is the one we live in or we exist in today, it is very difficult to talk about one single authority or one single normative way of doing things. You can't say, for example, this is the way of writing a story or this is the way of speaking poetry. You can have poetry now in written form. You can have poetry these days in spoken art form. You can have poetry these days that is exists in virtual space. That means poetry that is recorded and transmitted using social media platforms, etc. So manners of existence in which forms of literature are alive today are multiplicitous and are variegated. We can't talk of one single standard the way we would talk of a normative standard of doing things way back. And this is in itself symptomatic of the realities that we live in today. We live in a world that is at the same time local and global. It is at the same time national and regional. It is at the same time continental and particular. And because of this, then the art which it itself is a spirit of a community or a spirit of a society is not immunized from these vagaries of time.
That is very informative. We are going for a very short break, and when we come back, we will look at the Afro-Asian influence in East Africa. Stay tuned in.
Are you an institution or individual? Do you intend to organize a memorable event to be archived for future reference? Then look no further than AAU Studios, because it's your best bet. With our spacious studio and state-of-the-art media equipment such as 4K Panasonic video cameras, KinoFlow lights, assorted microphones, live streaming machines, and others, you are sure to get the best of production. Visit us at Trinity Avenue, East Legon, adjacent the National Accreditation Board, or contact the AAU Studio via the following addresses: info@aau.org, AAUTV@aau.org, Ransford @aau.org. Alternatively, you can call us on 0244 185 998 or 0244 693 342.
Welcome back to Diaspora Connect on AAU TV. You are following this discussion on the social media handles on your screen. I'm here at Kenyatta University and I'm talking about the Afro-Asian influence in the history of East Africa. And to do justice to this topic, I've been talking to Professor Makokha, who is a lecturer and a researcher here in this university. Prof, you have given a background about literature and the literature as told, the transmission of information from the ancient to modernity or the modern times. Now let's look particularly at the diasporan aspect of the East African literature.
Thank you. Of course, the professor is a bigger title, but yeah, that's fine. My title is Dr. Makokha, and yes, indeed, I'm a specialist of East African literatures, which is a regional body that encompasses the national and linguistic traditions of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania primarily, but also secondarily the literatures of the greater East African coastal line, all the way from Somalia to Kenya to Tanzania to northern Mozambique and the islands that exist between East Africa and India. You may want to think of Seychelles, the Reunion Island, the Comoros Islands, Mauritius, etc. Now, what is interesting about the literature of East Africa, and this sets it slightly apart from the regional traditions of literatures of the rest of the continent, is the manner in which these East African societies themselves are multiracial and are affiliated to multiple religious traditions. Right. Eastern Africa as a region was colonized by one primary imperial force, that is Britain, and this has managed to make the core country that make up this particular region, Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania, to also have a very solid regional integration spirit. Okay. Here in East Africa, for example, we have the East African Community, which is the regional body like ECOWAS in West Africa, or SADC in Southern Africa. And the regional body, East African Community, is based in Arusha. But although this regional body is a post-colonial phenomenon, is a post-independent phenomenon, mooted by Obote of Uganda, Kenyatta of Kenya, and Nyerere of Tanzania, they did not create the regional consciousness or the regional framework or the regional community on no, they did not create it on a nullity. Okay. They did not create it out of the vacuum. Right. There was already an existing template that they were only hearkening to in order to meet their post-independence nationalist goals of regional integration. And one of the templates they were operating on was the Swahili language. Right. The fact that here in East Africa we have today, according to Professor Mulokozi of the Institute of Kiswahili Research at University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, we today have almost 280 million speakers of Swahili language scattered across this broad region, all the way up to the coasts of the Horn of Africa. And Kiswahili itself is symptomatic of the connections that have existed between the people of this East African territory among themselves, primarily as a result of trade. One of the reasons why Swahili started as a coastal language of a small group of people, primarily in Kenya around the Lamu archipelago near southern Somalia, and spread into this particular geography, is because trade was considered to be a very important part of this region in the past 500 to 600 years. Yeah. As a result of this particular fertile trade between peoples of the hinterland, people living in the region that is beyond the coastline, and the people who live at the coastline, because of this long distant trade, which was primarily based on barter trade system, of exchanging goods for goods rather than money, this particular trade became so visible to other people from other regions. Right. And because of this, then the Arabs who occupied especially Oman and Yemen became aware of this fertile growth in terms of commercial proclivity that existed in the East African space, and they plugged themselves into this particular trade, and the trade then expanded not only from East African coastline, but into the Arabian Peninsula and further into the Indian subcontinent. So it means that, in essence, the primary reason why the Arabs infiltrated or came to the East African sub-region was for trade, not for religion. It was not for religion. Religion for trade. Okay. For trade particularly. All right. When they arrived for trade, as a result of the nature of Islam, that Islam is not just a religion but is a way of life. Okay. When they came as Arabs, traders, in small portions to begin with, almost 1 millennium ago, when they came as traders and settled among the coastal communities. Right. For example, among the Mijikenda of Kenya, among the Zaramo of Tanzania, among the Bantu communities that live in Nampula province of northern Mozambique, around Beira, and so on and so forth. When they arrived as traders, and because they settled among these communities, and Islam itself is a way of life as well, the communities, some of them, and some of the members of these communities managed to accept Islam first as a way of life, and also secondarily as a religion. And they became Islamized. They then would wear, eat, dress, and build their architecture in the fashion of the traders who had come from the Muslim worlds in Arabia. We have a very unique word in Kiswahili about this process of cultural hybridity and cultural adoption.
Okay.
The word we use is ustaarabu. Ustaarabu. When you say that I am a mustaarabu, you mean that you are a person who is practicing the concept of ustaarabu. Okay. The concept of ustaarabu can be roughly translated into English as civilization.
Okay.
So to be a mustaarabu is to be a civilized person.
Right.
The normative standard for civilizing at that time was Islam, because this was the standard that was considered to be superior to the one that had existed earlier among the Bantu communities. Okay. So to say that you are a mustaarabu, it meant that you have accepted Islam, you know how to read and write in Arabic, you are embracing the cultural paradigms of the Arabic civilization in terms of numeracy and literacy and religion. So a lot of black communities or African communities, Bantu communities primarily, adopted the Arabic way of life as a manner of cultural exchange between an inferior and allegedly superior culture. And because of that template then, one may then see that the earlier templates of written literature in East Africa started from the coastal part of the region, and they started on the basis of Arabic language and Arabic alphabet. This literature today is considered arcane, it is considered archaic, it is not very fertile as an area. We only talk of old manuscripts written in Kiswahili, but using the Arabic alphabet, Arabic language and Arabic alphabet from Lamu, from Dar es Salaam, from Zanzibar, from Mombasa, and other older coastal city-states. This is not very different from what happened in West Africa, for example. You look at the existence of Arabic civilization among the black populations of West Africa. You see places like Timbuktu, you see places like Gao, you see places like Kaduna, you see places in Katsina and that Sahel belt in West Africa. And there exists that kind of literature which is written in Arabic language, but it is primarily in Wolof or Mandinka or Fulani or Hausa. They have a word for it, I think, out there. They talk of it as Ajami literature, and it's the same concept that exists here. A literature that is written, but it's not written in European languages. It's written in Arabic by the locals of East Africa, and this literature today we classify it in order to distinguish it from the post-colonial traditions written in English, or in order to distinguish it from the oral traditions written, produced in Gikuyu or in Somali or in Kiluya. We talk of this earlier extant literature as classical East African literature. Then we now have the oral literature, which is a second category. And then finally we have the Anglophone literature as a result of colonialism.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very insightful. Okay. Now let's wrap up this discussion. Was there slavery along the coast of East Africa? And if they were, who were the slave masters? Who were the slave masters? And then what had been the impact of slavery on East Africa?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's a thorny question indeed, because as a scholar of East African literatures and cultures, it has always been alive to my attention that little has been done in terms of research on literatures or literary works that dwell on the topic of slavery on the eastern seaboard of Africa. When you compare these especially with what has been done on the western part of the continent, then there is that discrepancy. There's that discrepancy. Slavery indeed occurred in East Africa in many ways. One may think in line with Wole Soyinka at one point, or Ali Mazrui at one point, that slavery was not alien to the autochthonous communities of Africa. We had what we may call homegrown slavery, which more or less was as a result of war and similar conflicts. These ethnic wars would then culminate into people being taken as prisoners of war, and they would be put under a category that may broadly be called a category of slaves. But what separated them from the normative conceptualization of what a slave is that they had the capacity to be they had a capacity to be absorbed by the communities that had held them captive. For example, if the Maasai community was fighting with the Gikuyu community in Kenya, they would take prisoners of wars, but these prisoners of wars would have the window of rehabilitating their own selves by adopting the Maasai or the culture of the victor, and as a result lose that slavery title or that slavery identity, which of course comes with a lot of its backloads. If I may just continue very quickly and say, as a result of that traditional conceptualization of slavery, the slavery that we talk about today in relation to East African societies is one that is a little bit new. Okay. This is a slavery that I can see as a direct consequence of that mercantile trade that I've mentioned, the trade between East Africa, Asia, and the Arabian Peninsula. And that particular trade, the Trans-Indian Ocean trade, necessitated the conditions for the physical uprooting of people from their various communities, now not as war captives, but as commodities or in the market. Yeah. The situation exacerbated itself, of course, in the 19th century when the Sultan called Said moved his headquarters from Muscat in Oman to Zanzibar, the better to be able to oversee and control the rich East African trade that I've already said existed for several centuries before the coming of the Arabs. Okay. And when he moved his domicile from Muscat to Zanzibar, what occurred is that the Arab presence now in East Africa became one that can be almost equated to colonial. And as a result of this, then there was a massive rise in the need for slaves. Now not for war purposes, but slaves for markets in Asia or in the Orient world. These slaves who would then be taken to work in domestic situations, in homesteads, in Arabia, and also as far as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. When this situation happened in the 19th century, we now talk of a phenomenon within East African history called the East African slave trade. Okay. Now, when we talk about the East African slave trade, we are talking about that slave trade that was conducted by the Muscat Arabs from Oman, who had moved with Said to Zanzibar and made Zanzibar their headquarters. And as a result of that, the Zanzibar slave market became the largest slave market in East Africa. Okay. There were smaller ones in places like Tanga, places like Mutwara. They were holding markets and holding warehouses for slaves in hinterland towns like Tabora in central Tanzania, or places like Ujiji, where the famous meeting between H.M. Stanley and David Livingstone happened in the 1870s. Okay. And when we look at East African slavery in that context of the 19th century trade dominated by the Arabs, servicing the slave markets and slave demands of the Orient world, then we are talking about a slave trade that was not only deep in terms of its impact as a trade or as a commercial activity, but also in terms of culture. Okay. What I mean is that there are populations that were taken away from their homelands in East Africa, and some of these populations which were taken away have never recovered. Okay. We have communities in Mumbai, for example, the CD communities in Mumbai, who are descendants of African slaves who were set free after British imperialism occurred in India, and they have never returned to East Africa. So they exist as black diasporas in India, in Mumbai especially. And these communities like the CD, for example, of Gujarati, are today making connections with East Africa in a kind of cyclic migration of not just of people but of culture. A lot of interest is now emerging with people like Professor Abdul Sharif from Zanzibar, people like the novelist Abdul Razak Gurna from Zanzibar, who are now questioning the place of slavery in the history and cultural memories of East African communities.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is very insightful. Yeah. And you've told us more about Afro-Asian literature than we have ever read. Viewers, this is where we bring our episode of Diaspora Connect to an end. Stay tuned in to other programs on AU TV. Until next time when I come again your way, my name is Ransford Bekoe. Take care.